Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and now I will set out to say the share that I originally intended saying today, which is we will be learning Mias Hashem Daf limud Zayin Amid Beis, and I hope limud Ches Amid Aleph as well. So we are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin, and we pick up today in Siman Chav Zayin Sivav, bottom line with the Shulchan Aruch limud Zayin Amid Aleph. Says the Mechaber, we have learned that the Shel Yad is supposed to be placed onto the left arm. Why is the Shel Yad placed onto the left arm? So we learned that we darshan from the pasuk ukishartam la'os al yodecha. It's supposed to go on your hand, and yodecha we darshan yad keha. It means the weak hand. We could see this on Lamed Vav Amid Aleph, very beginning of Siman. Siman Chav Zayin Sif Aleph Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Aleph. The Mishnah Berurah said Midiksiv Yodecha Behei. Since the word Yodecha in the Torah Dirshu is written Yud Daled Chav Hei, which is an interesting spelling. It's not Yud Daled and a Chav with a kamatz. It's a Yud Daled Chav and then a Hei. So Perish Yad Keha. The Gemara darshans the weak hand. Tahainu hasmoil, which is typically the left hand, shehi tasha the keha, which is weak. Va'oi darshu, and the Gemara Menachos gives us another drasha, and this second drasha is going to come into play today as well. Midiksiv, because it says in the pasuk ukishartam, you should tie the tefillin onto your hands, ukishartam la'isa yadecha, and then it says uchesavtam al mezuzah speisecha visharecha, and you should write the parsha of Kriyas Shema al mezuzah speisecha. This is a reference to the mitzvah of mezuzah, and the Gemara darshans maksiva biyamin, just as typically writing is done by most people with the right hand, shekein derech b'nei adam, af kishira biyamin, so too the tying on of the tefillin should be performed with the right hand. Now, if you're tying it on with the right hand, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'keven de kishira biyamin, since the act of tying is performed with the right hand, memela hanacha b'smail, it would come out that the tefillin would be put onto the left hand. Okay. That's what we learned at the beginning of Siman Chav Zayin. Now, says the Mechaber here, Lamed Zayin Amid Aleph, bottom line, Sivav, V'iter Yad Yaminai, a lefty, Im Oisek Kol Malachtoi B'Smoiloi, if he does everything with his left hand, if his left hand is his dominant hand, so he performs most tasks with his left hand, Meniach B'Smoiloi, he will have to put his tefillin on to what is his left hand. What does that mean, says the Mechaber? Shehu Yamin Shel Kaladam, which is everybody else's right hand. In other words, says the Mechaber, what's the drasha? The drasha is la'is al yadecha, that you're supposed to put the tefillin onto the weaker hand, yad keha. So a lefty, his left hand essentially is his right hand, because the right hand is always the stronger hand. The lefty, his left hand is his stronger hand, so his left hand is really his right hand. And he therefore has to put his tefillin on what is considered his left hand, his weaker hand, which is everybody else's right hand. So the easy way of saying that is, a lefty puts his tefillin where? On his right arm. Not on his left arm, on his right arm. Okay. It seems like we said very little, but we actually said a lot. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah back on Lamed Zayin, Amid Aleph, 4 lines off the bottom. Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Chaf Aleph. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol limud. Ois Cotton Chaf Aleph, Ayin Le'el B'Sif Cotton Yud Beis. He sends us back to Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Yud Beis, where we discussed this in the previous share, what a lefty should do if he only has access to a righty's tefillin. So if you remember, what we learned was that if a lefty is going to put on a righty's tefillin, so instead of putting on the tefillin the way they're typically put on, so that the ma'barta, the place that the ritzua goes through, is upwards towards the shoulder, and the ketzitza, right? See, normally we put on tefillin that the mabarta is up towards the shoulder, the ketzitza is down towards the yad, and the kesher the yud is against the body where it's supposed to be. But if a lefty is going to put on a righty's tefillin, it's not going to be that way if he does it in the normal way. If he puts it on in the normal way with the ma'barta facing up, now look where the kesher is. Now the kesher is pointing away from the body, away from the lathe. So what did we learn? We learned in the Biur Halacha that what the lefty should do with the righty's tefillin is he should actually flip the bias upside down so that the ma'barta is... let me just get the Ritzu over there. Where are we? Okay. You should do this. You should position the tefillin so that the ma'barta is facing down. The ma'barta is facing down towards the arm. The ketzitza is facing up, but the kesher is where it properly should be. It's against the guf. So that's what the Mishnah Berurah is referring to here in Ois Katan Chaf Aleph when he sends us back to Siv Katan Yud Beis. Ois Katan Chaf Beis, Yad Yaminoi, Iter Yad Yaminoi, fancy way of saying a lefty. Now here is a very fascinating halacha that I bet a lot of people don't know. Let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. Va'afilu nasa iter, even if somebody became a lefty, al yedei shehirgel atzmai achar kach, he made himself a lefty. V'loi noilad kach, he wasn't born that way. He made himself a lefty. He trained himself to do everything with his left hand, and now his left hand has become his dominant hand, and he cannot perform all tasks well with his right hand. So his right hand sort of has atrophied. I don't mean that it atrophied in that physically it deteriorated, but because he trained himself to do everything with his left hand, he can't do them anymore with his right hand. His right hand is not malumid b'kach. Yaniach biyamin. That person has a din of a lefty. He would have to put his tefillin on his right arm. Because again, what's the drasha? The drasha is yad keha. You have to put the tefillin on the weaker arm. Well, this person has made his right arm his weaker arm. The cholshkein, and here comes the part that I said I think most people don't know. The cholshkein in min hashamayim hirgiluhu. Certainly, if somebody was not born a lefty, but he was made a lefty min hashamayim. What does this mean? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Dahainu shenoilad loy chayli biyaminoi. He got some sort of an affliction on his right hand. V'nitala kayach mimenu. And he lost the kayach of his right hand. Let's say Nebuch lo Aleinu, somebody was a righty his whole life. So his right hand was his dominant hand. And he always put his tefillin on his left arm. And then he had a stroke. And because of the stroke, his right hand became paralyzed. And he can't do anything with his right hand. Well, now, which arm is his Yad Kea? Which one is the Yad Kea? Now the right hand is the Yad Kea. Well, now he's going to have a din of a lefty. Now he's going to have to put his tefillin on his right arm. Or shenikta loy kaf yodai yamanis. Chas v'chalila, somebody, the hand, his right hand was cut off. V'tzarech lasis kol malachta b'smail. So now he has to do everything with his left hand. So which arm is the Yad Kea? The right one. Bevadai dinoi ki'iter gomer. This person has the halacha of a lefty. V'yaniach al yad haritzutza. And he has to put the tefillin on the damaged arm. So again, a very fascinating halacha. Somebody spent his whole life putting his tefillin on his left arm. And then Nebuch lo Aleinu, he had a stroke. And now his right arm became the Yad HaRitzutza. It's the damaged arm and it's the Yad Keha. He has to switch. He has to put his tefillin onto his right arm. But if he recovers, now let's say he becomes a sholit b'shtei yadav. He becomes completely ambidextrous. He could work equally with either arm. Harehu k'chaladam. Then he would have the din of every regular person, and then he would put his tefillin back onto his left arm. Ois Katan Chaf Gimel. The phraseology of the Mechaber discussing the lefty was im oise kol malachtoi b'smoiloi. He does all of his labors with his left hand. Says the Chavetz Chaim, that language is not 100% precise. Hu adin afilu rak roiv malachtoi doesn't have to be kol malachtoi, that he does everything with his left arm. Even if roiv, most physical tasks he does with his left arm, his left hand, that makes him a lefty. This person, meniach bismoiloi, he puts the tefillin onto his left hand. What does that mean, his left hand? It means his weaker hand, which is everybody else's right. So essentially, he puts it on his right arm. Ve'menichai biyaminoi, says the Chavetz Chaim, if this individual were to put his tefillin on to his right hand, meaning his left, shu smoil kaladam, af b'di'evet lo yotza. He wouldn't be yotze even b'di'evet. V'ayin b'bi'ar halacha, there's a bi'ar halacha over here, dibur hamaschil, b'niach b'smoiloi, who brings down a different shita who holds that b'di'evet he would be yotze, but the bi'ar halacha is not happy with that shita. So he paskins, he's machriya over here in the Mishnah Berurah, that if a lefty puts tefillin on his left arm, he's not yotze. Or a righty puts on his right arm, not yotze. Always has to be a yad keah. Now continues the mechaber, top line, middle of the line. V'im sholet b'shtei yodav. Let's say a person is ambidextrous. Now, what does that mean, he's ambidextrous? So the Mishnah Berurah defines what ambidextrous means. Mishnah Berurah is katan chafei, sholet b'shtei yodav. Somebody who's ambidextrous, he could use either arm. Ritzayna loymar, what the mechaber wants to say, sholet b'shtei yodav is, she'oise kol hamalachos b'shneihem shaveh b'shaveh. He could use either arm equally. It doesn't mean I could play ping pong with my right arm and I could play ping pong with my left hand, and I might be able to beat somebody with either one, but if I really want to win, I play with my right arm. That's not called ambidextrous. That's called a very talented individual. I happen to know somebody like that. He can beat lots of people. He's a righty. He could beat lots of people in ping pong playing lefty. But when he plays somebody good, he has to play righty. So that person's a righty. That's not called sholet b'shtei yodav. That's called a uniquely talented individual. But that's not called sholet b'shtei yodav. Avalim nokeloi lasos b'smoil. Somebody who it's easier for him to accomplish tasks with his left arm, but he could use the right also. That's not called ambidextrous. Ken muchach l'kaman b'simin tafresh non aleph and hilchas tal minim b'shari tshuva ayin sham. Okay, let's go back upstairs to the mechaber over here. So v'im sholet b'shtei yodav, if somebody is truly ambidextrous, meaning he can accomplish things mamish equally the same, right hand or left hand, maniach b'smoil kaladam, then he goes by typical people. For the vast majority of people, the yad keha is the left hand. So since this individual doesn't really have a yad keha, he could use either one, so we apply to him the halacha of most people. He puts his tefillin on his left hand. Now comes a very, very interesting halacha. Says the mechaber, second line down. V'im kaisev biyaminoi. Let's say somebody writes with his right hand. Ushar kol ma'asav v'asav b'smoiloi, and he does everything else with his left hand. So when it comes to most tasks, he's a lefty. He does everything with his left hand, but he writes with his right hand. Or the opposite. Kaisev b'smoil, he writes with his left hand. Ushar kol ma'asav v'asav b'yamin, he does everything else with his right hand. So now we have a famous machlokes. Yesh Oimrim, we have a rush in the name of the Baal HaTrumas. Yesh Oimrim, sheyaniach tefillin biyad shetash kayach. There are those that say, well, what's the limud from the Gemara? The limud from the pasuk is yad keha. You put it on the weak hand. So yesh Oimrim sheyaniach tefillin biyad shetash kayach. He should still put his tefillin on the weaker hand. What does ksiva have to do with it? If somebody writes with his left hand, but he does everything else with his right hand, so his yad keah is his left hand, even though he writes with his left hand, but his yad keah is his left hand, so he should put his tefillin on his left hand. Li'idach kisa, the other person, he writes with his left hand, but he writes with his right hand, but he does everything else with his left hand. So then which hand is the yad keah? The right hand. So he should have the din of a lefty. So that's the first sheet over here. He should put it on the yad keah. The be'inon yad keah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chavav shetash kayach. Ritzayna loymar, what the mechaber wants to say in this day of Rishona is the ksiva ein lo shum ma'ila mishar malacha yechidus. There's no ma'ila, there's no greater value given to the malacha of writing than to anything else. Ukishartam la'ois al yodecha. You have to put your tefillin on your Yad Keha. Just because you happen to write with your Yad Keha, there's no special preference given to the malach of writing. You put your tefillin on your Yad Keha. That's which hand you put your tefillin on. So we go after the majority of tasks. If you do the majority of tasks with your left hand, then your left hand is the dominant hand. Your Yad Keha is the right hand. You put it on your right hand. You do most tasks with your right hand, then your right hand is the dominant hand. Which is your Yad Keha? Your left hand. And I don't care which hand you write with. V'hi nikre smoil. So that's the day of Rishona. But then we have the day of Shnia. This is a Tur, a Smak, Hagos Maimoni, Rabbeinu Yechiel. 3 lines down near the end of the line. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh Oimrim, Shahayad shekoisiv ba, hi chashuva yamin le'inyan zeh. There's another shita that holds that in the context of Hilchas Tefillin, which hand is considered the right hand, which hand is considered the dominant hand, the one you write with. Umaniach tefillin b'yad shekenegda, and you put tefillin on the other hand. So do we care which hand you do most tasks with? No. We give preference to the hand that you write with. That's the dominant hand. And the other hand is the Yad Keha, and that's the hand you put tefillin on. And the Ramah says, Hagav hachi nohug. The Ramah says that we're noyig, like the day of Shnia, that we go basar writing. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chavzayin Chashuva Yamin. This is the day of Shnia, that the hand that you write with is called the right hand. Where does this come from? What's the rationale for it? Explains the Mishnah Berurah that it comes from a pasuk. It comes from the other drasha that I told you at the outset of the shir. Tiksiv, because it says in the pasuk, Ukeshartam la'ois al yodecha, v'hayu l'taitafa ispein einecha, uchesavtam, and you should write them al mezuzas beisecha v'sharecha. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Tiksiv ukeshartam uchesavtam. There's a hekish between tefillin and mezuzah. Mashba, the implication of this hekish is the ba'oisa yad shekoisiv ba, that the hand that you use to write a mezuzah, tzarech likshar es tefillin al yad shekenegdai. That's the hand that you need to use to tie on the tefillin, which means that you have to tie the tefillin onto the opposite hand. It means that if you write, if you were going to write a mezuzah, you would write a mezuzah with your left hand, then you have to tie on the tefillin with your left hand, which means that you have to put the tefillin on the right hand. So that's the rationale for this day of Shnia that holds that everything goes after what you write with. The hand that you write with, that's the dominant hand. Miu, however, in the context of this day of Shnia, the Mishnah Berurah says an interesting thing. Miu kishaloi noilad kain. In this case, if somebody was not born that way naturally, rak achakach hirgalatzvoi lichtav b'smail, he just trained himself to write with his left hand, ushar ma'isa v'isa b'yamin, but Itaka does everything else with his right hand, then we don't give preference to writing. Yaniach b'smail kaladam, he would be treated like everybody else, he would put his tefillin on his left arm. V'adam she'en yachal lichtav, how about somebody who doesn't know how to write? According to this day of Shnia, what do we do with this person? He doesn't know how to write, so we can't judge by writing. Says the Mishnah Berurah, then writing is certainly not the arbiter. If this person doesn't know how to write, we can't use writing as the arbiter. So then we have to go after all other tasks, and we go, and that the hand that he does the majority of tasks with, that's what we consider to be the dominant hand. So again, what did we have here so far? A righty puts his tefillin on his left arm. Why? Yad Keha, weak hand. Question became, what do we do with somebody who has a dominant hand, but he writes with the other hand? So over there, we have another drasha in the Gemara. We have a drasha ukeshartam uchesavtam. We have a hekish between kshiras tefillin, tying on the tefillin, and ksivas mezuzah. That drasha tells me that the hand that you would write a mezuzah with, that's the hand that you have to perform the tying on of the tefillin with, which means that you would have to put the tefillin on the opposite hand that you write with. So the question became, somebody, his dominant arm is his right arm, but he writes with his left hand. What's his din? So we have a day of Rishona and a day of Shnia. The day of Rishona is that we go basar most tasks. We always follow the drasha of Yad Keha, of Yodecha. So We always go basar, the weaker hand. You always put tefillin on the weaker hand, regardless of what hand you write with. The Dirshu says we go after writing. The hand that you write with, that's the dominant hand, and we put tefillin on the other hand. We have a Ramah that says v'hachi nog. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah is cut l'chav ches. V'hachi nog, like the Dirshu, that we go basar writing. Ayin b'biur halacha, he sends us to the biur halacha, dibur hamaschil v'hachi nog, which is a lengthy and somewhat complex biur halacha. However, I'm going to direct your attention to Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, 3 lines down in the biur halacha, where it says v'hagra b'biuroi. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'hagra b'biuroi hechzik legamri kedeya harishayna. The gra paskins like the day of Rishona. The lawyers lean on klal basaksiva, that we don't give any preference to the malacha of writing. V'im kain, and if so, according to the gra, im kaisev biyamin, if you would have somebody who writes with his right hand, ushar ma'isa v'isa b'smail, but he does everything else with his left hand. So which hand is his dominant hand? His left hand. So which hand does he put tefillin on? He puts tefillin onto his right arm. Yaniach biyamin. He would put on his tefillin onto his right hand. That's the Shitas Hagra. Now the biur halacha, in the rest of the Chavetz Chaim, the rest of the biur halacha, he seeks to be matzdik, the widespread minig, to be noyeg like the day of Shnia. Now why he works so hard to be matzdik it, the Ramah says that we pass like the day of Shnia. But he's uncomfortable because the Gra goes like the day of Rishona. And one of the reasons why they seem to be uncomfortable with the day of Shnia is because, like I told you, the Gemara brings down 2 drashas. But the drasha that we seem to take on lahalacha is Yad Keah. You ask anybody, why do we put tefillin on the left arm? Because it says Yadacha, Yad Keah. The other drasha, ukishartam uchesavtam, we don't seem to take that drasha halacha lamaisa. So why now suddenly by a lefty does writing become the arbiter of which arm you should put the tefillin on? Seems a little bit odd. And indeed, the Aruch HaShulchan doesn't paskin that way. The Aruch HaShulchan says like this. He brings down the 2 shitas. He brings down the Day Shnia, and he says, "V'yesh oimrim shaholchen achar aksiva." There are those that say that you follow writing. Why? Mishum diksivu kashartam uchasavtam. V'hayat shekaisev ba, and the hand that you write with, hi hayamin, that's the hand that we call the yamin. Umaniach ba'acheres, and you have to put the tefillin on the opposite arm. V'ha'ikar ledina kedeya harishayna. And he paskins like the day of Rishayna. And then he brings down in parentheses, gra, sifkat yud zayin. And he says, why? Why do we paskin like the day of Rishayna? The drasha the Yad Keah hu lahalacha. Masha'in kein drasha hu de ukishartam uchasavtam. Nira lehedya b'shas she'ena lahalacha. If you look at the Gemara in Menachos, it doesn't seem that we accept the drasha of ukishartam uchasavtam lahalacha. We don't adopt that lahalacha. So the Aruch HaShulchan is not mahiz machriya, the opposite of the Chavetz Chaim over here. And if somebody has the shaila of a lefty or a righty, I would say that you should bring it to the attention of a gadol to get a psak. Again, it's not every lefty or righty. The question of somebody who does a lot with his right hand, but writes with his left hand, where you seem to have a contradiction between the stronger arm and the hand that he writes with, that should be brought to a gadol b'Yisrael. I actually had this with one of my children, and I brought him to my Rebbe's Alzheimer's Stark, Reb Feinstein, and when he sat down by the desk opposite Reb Ruben quickly threw something at him to see which hand he would catch it with, and he caught it with his left hand. And when Reb Ruben saw that he caught it with his left hand, he pasked he's a lefty. I'm not saying that so that you should now take that and use it to be dama milsa la milsa and use it for psak lamaisa. If you have a shaila, ask a shaila. Okay, now we move along 4 lines down in the Mechaber Lamed Zayin Amud Beis Siman Chav Zayin Siv Zayin. Says the Mechaber, Af al pi sheyesh la'adam makkah b'mekayim hanachas hatfilin. Even if somebody, Nebuch, has some kind of an affliction on his arm in the place where he typically puts his tefillin, yoniach tefillin. He should still put on tefillin. Why? Ki makam yesh bazraya lo yoniach shtei tefillin. Because there's room on your arm to put on 2 pairs of tefillin. The area on your kibiris, the area on the bicep, on the upper arm, where you are properly supposed to place the tefillin, there's room for more than 1 pair of tefillin. So if you have a makkah, somebody has a very painful blister or some kind of sunburn or some kind of skin affliction where he typically puts on the tefillin, so move over the bias a little bit and put it on next to it. There should be room there where you could still be yotzeh tefillin. Because the bone that goes from the elbow up to the armpit, from the halfway point going up down until the elbow, almost that whole area is kosher for anachas hatfilin. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to jump up right away and say not the entire area. You're not allowed to put the tefillin on down over here, right by the elbow where the bicep isn't over there. And for this, I think we got to roll up our sleeves. Now we got the hard work going, so we got to roll up our sleeves, right? You have over here where you put on the tefillin, so you can't put the tefillin on down over here because that's off the bicep. But there is plenty of room over here on the bicep, from halfway up the arm and down. Halfway up my arm is about here. Truth is that I measured halfway up my arm is already after my bicep. So if I wanted to put my tefillin on after the halfway mark, I wouldn't be yotzeh anyway because it wouldn't be on the kibiris. But there's plenty of room from the halfway mark and down. You could put on more than 1 pair of tefillin, and therefore, says the Mechaber, if you have an affliction where you typically put on the tefillin, there still should be room to put on tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Chavtes, Ada Kubadoi, from the halfway point and down until the elbow. Ritzana Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Babasar hatapuach, on the muscle, on the bicep, Asher Litzada Kubadoi, the part of the bicep that is lower down, going down towards the elbow. V'loi Ada Kubadoi mamish, but not mamish down till the elbow, because you're not allowed to put the Shel Yad beneath the bicep. But if the affliction that somebody has is covering the entire bicep, then, or at least, let's say he's not like me. Let's say by him, part of the bicep extends beyond the halfway mark going up towards the shoulder. And he has a situation where the entire bicep from the halfway point and down is afflicted with a makkah. But the part of the bicep that's from the halfway point and up is not afflicted with a makkah. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah like this: if the entire bicep is afflicted with a makkah, from the halfway point and down towards the elbow, he could rely on those shitas that are makel, and I believe this was a gra. If this person has part of his bicep, he's a bodybuilder, he has part of his bicep that extends upward past the halfway mark, according to the gra, you're allowed to put tefillin on over there. According to other shitas, you're not allowed to put the tefillin above the halfway mark, even if it's on the bicep. But according to the gra, if it's still on the bicep, you're allowed to put it there. So if this person cannot put his tefillin on below the halfway mark, because over there he has a makkah, but he could put it on above the halfway mark, he should be saimach on the gra, and he should put it on above the halfway mark. And if the makkah is very large, and it covers up the entire area that he could possibly put on tefillin, and he'll have a lot of pain, Nebuch, if he tries to put on tefillin, Potter milahaniach Tefillin Shel Yad, he's exempt. He's potter from putting on the Tefillin Shel Yad, afilu nishalai makayim, even if he has place. In other words, yes, there's room on the body to put on the tefillin, but if it's going to be exceedingly painful and he can't bring himself to do it, then he's an honest, he's potter. V'yaneh shel rosh levad, so you should put on only the tefillin shel rosh, u'kedil el b'siman chavav ayin sham, and he should follow the processes that we discussed in Siman Chavav as far as the bracha. He should put on the shel rosh, and he should make a lahaniach and an al mitzvahs on the shel rosh. V'ayin ma shekasavnu b'sif hey b'sif katan yud ches. Yeah, where we spoke about that as well, what to do as far as the brachas. Okay. Now we move along to Sif Ches, 4 lines up on Lamed Zayin Amud Beis in the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mechaber, Oirech Ritzua Shel Yad. What is the necessary length of the Ritzua of the Shel Yad? Says the Mechaber, and we're going to do some show and tell over here. Says the Mechaber, Oirech Ritzua Shel Yad, the proper minimum length of the Ritzua of the Shel Yad, Kedei Shetakif Ez Hazroya, it has to be long enough to go around the arm. So, over here, I have the Ritzua going around the arm. It's got to be long enough to go around the arm, V'yikshar mimena hakesher, and make a kesher. This is not referring to the kesher, to the yud that's on the bias. It means this kesher over here on my arm with the loop that I'm using to tighten, to tie the bias onto the arm. So the ritzua has to be long enough to go around the arm and make that kesher to tie it on. Then what? So kadesha takif es azraya, v'yiksha mimena kesher, v'timosach, and then spread the ritzua down al etzba ha'emtsois. So I'm bringing the ritzua in a straight line. I'm not making any krichos, and I'm bringing it down to my middle finger. And then what do we have to do? Says the Mechaber, v'yikroich mimena al etzbai, and make krichos, make windings on the finger, shloisha krichos, 3 windings, 1, 2, 3, v'yikshar, and then tie it. What does it mean to tie it? So the Mishnah Berurah doesn't say, but I'll tell you what the Aruch HaShulchan says. What does it mean to tie it? Well, we don't tie it down here. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, he says, Keloimar, what does this mean, v'yikshar? Sheyitachev haritzua, you should tuck in the ritzua, ba'oifen shetiskayim, in a manner so that what you just did will stay. In other words, if I let go right now, what's going to happen? It's going to fall off. Well, that's not good. You didn't do anything then. So you got to have enough ritzua to tie it onto the arm, go down to the finger, make 3 windings, 1, 2, 3, and then yitchayv. And then you got to tuck it in or something. I have a lot of extra ritzua here because we're talking about the minimum length. So you got to be able to, tuck it in or something, but you got to do something so that it should stay that way. That's the minimum length of the ritzuas. So note, do we need enough ritzua to be able to make 7 windings on the arm? No, we don't. So minimum, you need enough to go around the arm, tighten it, get down to the finger, and make 3 krichos. Okay, continues the Mechaber 2 lines off the bottom. V'noyag in ha'olam, the Welt is noyeg, likreich al hazraya, to make windings around the arm, shisha or shiva krichos, 6 or 7 krichos, and it is brought down, I think it's the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan brings down the minig that I learned from Rav Moshe Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Vracha. He brings down over here, V'noyeg in ha'olam likreich gam sheva krichos al yad. The minig is to make 7 windings around the arm. Keneged shiva tevos shebe pasuk paiseach es yadecha umazbia lechol chai ratzon. And I do what Rav Moshe Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Vracha did. I say as I'm winding it around, I say, Paisech es yodecha umazbia l'chol chai rotza. Now, important caveat, I don't make these 7 windings before I put on the shalosh. You would not be allowed to say Paisech es yodecha umazbia l'chol chai rotza before you put on the shalosh, because that would be a hefsek. So what I do is, when I make the bracha on the Shel Yad, I make the bracha on the Shel Yad, and all I do is this. 1, 2, 3. And then I go down to the finger. 1, 2, 3. Then I put on the Shalosh. Then after I put on the Shalosh, I say, Omechachmascha kelelyon tatzel alai, umiminascha tivineni, v'chastecha tagdel alai. And then I say, Paiseach es yadecha mazbiya chol chai ratzain. And then I come down here. Ve'rastich li lo'olam, ve'rastich li b'tzedek v'mishpat v'chesed, ve'rastich li b'amuna v'yadata es Hashem. Okay, but we'll get to that in greater detail later on. Okay, so again, what did we say over here? I'm just going to read Sif Ches over again. Oirich Ritzua Shel Yad, the proper minimum length of the Ritzua of the Shel Yad, Kadesha Ktakif es Azraya, it has to be long enough to be able to go around the arm, V'yikshar mimena hakesher, and tie the bias onto the arm with a kesher, V'timotach, and then bring it, stretch it down, al etzba emtzois, to the middle finger, v'yikrach mimena al etzbai shloisha krichais, and to make 3 windings around the middle finger, v'yikshar, and then to tie it in such a manner that everything will stay together. The noyeg in the olam, the velt is noyeg, likrech al azraya, to make windings on the arm, shisha ishiva krichais, 6 or 7 krichais. Hago, says the Ramah, ve'ein likrech haritzua al hatitura, kedei lechaska al hayad. The Ramah tells us a very interesting halacha. He says, do not do this. Some people, they tie on the Shel Yad, then they come with the Ritzua, and they make a winding. See, right now the Tefillin, the bias could really do this. So what these people do is they come like this, and they go on to the bias, and they do that. See what I just did? They make a winding that goes over the ketzitza, over the titura, and they use that to tie it down. Says the Ramah, do not do that. Why? We'll see in the Mishnah Berurah. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Ois katan lamed. Shloisha krichos. We make 3 windings around the finger. Now, precisely where do these windings go on the finger? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Shnayim ba'perek hatachtoin, 2 windings on the lower joint, ve'echad ba'perek ha'imtzai, and 1 on the middle joint. What does that mean? Well, you hold your finger up. Now, if you hold your finger up, the lower joint going down is this joint. The middle joint is this joint. The top joint is that joint. So, the Mishnah Berurah is telling me you do 2 on the lowermost joint. That's 2 windings here, and 1 on the middle joint, 1 over here. What order do you do them in? So from the way it's written over here, Shnayim ba'perek hatachtoin, 2 on the middle joint, and then 1 on the emtzai, it sounds like you do these 2 first, and then this one. Says the Mishnah Berurah, however, the yesh oimrim tetchila, that first, echad beperek ha-emtzai, first you do 1 on the middle one, and only then, v'achakach shnayim beperek hatachtoin, and then 2 on the lower one. That is what I do, and that I believe is what most people do, and this is brought down in the Sharet Tzion. He brings it down from the Mishpatzais Zahav. Now, very important, and I think this is the minig of most people, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'oisan hakrichos, those windings around the finger, yasa achar hanocha shel rosh. The windings that are done around the finger should be done after you put on the shel rosh. Now, what's interesting to me is that my memory, when I was a 13-year-old bacher, and my father, Olav Shalom, brought me to Rav Moshe Zechariah Kadosh Levracha, was that Rav Moshe showed me to make the 3 windings on the finger before I put on the Shel Rosh. And I seem to remember seeing him later on that's what he did. Reb Ruvain, Yibad L'chaim, Reb Ruvain, soll sein gesund und stark, he does not do the 3 windings before the Shel Rosh. He follows this Mishnah Berurah, and he just does 3 on the arm, and then he just makes a couple over here just to hold it on. And then he puts on the Shel Rosh, and then does the 7 windings, and then the 3 on the finger. And he says that the reason he does it that way is because he never heard differently from his father, and that's what the Mishnah Berurah says. So that's what he does. I heard differently, so that's what I do. Okay. Ois Kan Lamed Aleph, the Mechaber told us that the Welt is noyeg to make 6 or 7 windings around the arm. Ois Shiva, Va'anan Nahagin on Shiva. The Mishnah Berurah brings down from the Achrayim that the widespread minig is to make 7 windings around the arm. V'ayin b'shari tshuva shamasik. You take a look at the Shari Tshuva, who concludes that those 7 windings should be on the arm. It brings down that there are some that had the minig to make 3 windings up on the kiboris, up on the makam manachas hatfillin, on the bicep, so that they do this. They put on the tefillin and they go 1, 2, 3, and then over here 1, 2, 3, 4. He says, no, we don't do that. The 7 windings go on the arm proper, not up on the kiboris, on the makam hanachas hatfillin. Okay. Eis Kan Lamed Beis, Ve'ein Likroich. And the Ramah told us that we should not make an additional winding to go over the titura over here as a means of fastening the bias down to the arm. Why not? What's wrong with doing that? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Shekvar niskayim ukishartam b'ritzua sha'alam abarta. Because I don't care if the bias can swing down. You are already yoitza the chiyuv of ukishartam by tightening it on using the ritzua that goes through the mabarta on the top of the bias. Ukemay b'Tefillin Shel Rosh, it's no different than the Tefillin Shel Rosh shetolui b'ritzua shebasaycha mabarta, right? The Tefillin Shel Rosh, how did the Tefillin Shel Rosh stay on your head? I'm gonna put it on loosely so I have no shayla of a bracha. How does it go on, right? It's hanging by virtue of the ritzua that goes to the mabarta, but it could swing up and down, and that's called tied on. So the same thing by the yad. You don't have to have another way of anchoring it down by the titura. As long as it's tied on by the ritzua that goes through the mabarta, that's okay. Now, so far in this Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah didn't tell us a reason why we should not do it. He told us a reason why we don't have to do it. But why should we not do it? So now the Mishnah Berurah says, I'll tell you why you shouldn't do it. V'keven she'ein mitzvah klal bakricha, since you're not accomplishing anything, since there's no mitzvah to make that kricha, l'chein ein lahanicha ala titura, now you can't do it. You know why? Because the titura of the bias has more kedusha than the ritzua, and therefore ein lahanicha ala titura sheyesh ba kedusha yoser min ritzua. Don't take the ritzua and put it onto the titura. The titura is more kadosh than the ritzua. So if there's a need to do it, it's one thing, but if there's no need to do it, you don't do it. He says those who have the minig that they put on the shel rosh before they do the windings on the arm, yesh ayrim de yakal likrei charitzua ala ketzitza. Then there might taka be a reason to put another winding to tie it down. You know why? Shaloi tamush Tefillin Shel Yad mimekayma ad she'aniach shel rosh. You see, I do 3 windings on the arm, but let's say you don't do any windings on the arm at all. Let's say you put it on over here, and you do like the Mechaber said. You just stretch it down to the hand. Then it's going to be very loose up here. So then the Chavetz Chaim says, then there might be a valid reason to do another wind on the ketzitza, on the bias, in order to hold it down. And then it wouldn't be a problem of putting the ritzua, which is less kadosh, onto the bias that's more kadosh, because then you're doing it l'tzarech hamitzvah. And if you're doing it l'tzarech hamitzvah, it's okay. So Yesharim the Yachal Likrach Ritzua la Ketzitza Shaloi Tamish Tefillin Shel Yad Mamakaima Chinecha Sharosh V'achakach Yisirena, and then take it off the Yikrach Hashiva Krichais, and then make the 7 windings. Umi Shebata Yod of Tzares. Let's say somebody puts on his tefillin, and now he wants to take his shirt and he wants to pull his shirt down over the tefillin, because like we said in the previous year, V'haya L'chala Ois V'loi La'acherim La'ois. Right? The tefillin is supposed to be visible to you, but not to other people. But his shirt sleeve is very narrow. And by pulling it down over the tefillin, he's afraid he's going to pull the Tefillin Shel Yad out of its place. So again, he wants to make an extra kricha. He wants to make an extra winding around the bias in order to lock it into place. He also would be allowed to make another winding around the bias in order to lock it into place. Okay, I'm going to stop over here at Sif Tes, and I'm going to say again, maybe I'll even get to do another share yet later today. We'll see. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The schools of Limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. Ram Hashem should send Yeshua for us, Parnaset Sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the BS Goel Tzedek, but Beherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.